The battle was far from over. Humanity's forces, though determined, found themselves at a disadvantage in the virtual wargame. The Xanthar, with their superior intellect and technological advancements, had already proven themselves as masters of simulation. At first, humanity had expected a challenge, but this felt like something else, an overwhelming display of the Xanthar's superiority. Captain Alexander, leading humanity's fleet, could sense the pressure mounting. His forces were being outflanked at every turn. The Xanthar were calculating, precise, and they seemed to know every move before it even happened. As the simulations continued, Captain Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that the Xanthar were playing a different game than the one humanity had prepared for. The simulations were designed to be unpredictable, but the Xanthar made it look easy. Every strategy they tried to deploy was countered almost instantly. His fleet was falling apart, and morale was starting to drop. But in the midst of the chaos, Alexander had an idea. He gathered his team of officers in a war room deep within the command ship. The tension was thick. Their first few engagements had been disastrous. Even though the Xanthar were using simulations, their ability to predict humanity's every move seemed almost supernatural. Alexander stared at the holographic map of the battlefield, watching as the Xanthar's forces methodically destroyed his fleets. But then it hit him. The Xanthar's moves were too predictable. They weren't just relying on brute force or raw tactics. They were relying on something much more powerful, their arrogance. He turned to his team, his eyes sharp with focus. "We're not fighting a simulation. We're fighting their perception of us. The Xanthar think they've already won. They think we're nothing but weak opponents who rely on brute force. But what if we use that against them?" One of his officers, Lieutenant Carter, frowned, trying to keep up with the thought process. "You're saying we should trick them, use their own assumptions against them?" "Yes," Alexander replied. "They believe we can only fight with strength. But they haven't accounted for our unpredictability. They rely too heavily on patterns, on their calculations. We have to break those patterns." The idea was risky. In fact, it was dangerous. But at this point, they had nothing to lose. The Xanthar were too focused on their technology, their vast intellect, and their ability to read every move humanity made. It was time for humanity to fight on a different level, one the Xanthar couldn't anticipate. They needed to create chaos within the Xanthar's system. A simple change in the rules of the game could throw everything into disarray. The first step was to introduce a sense of unpredictability. Captain Alexander ordered his fleet to start making moves that made no sense to the Xanthar's algorithms. They would split their forces into seemingly random formations, attacking from odd angles. Nothing was supposed to make sense. Every movement would defy logic. It wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about breaking the Xanthar's grip on the game. As the first phase of the new plan began, the Xanthar's response was immediate. At first, they seemed confused but still composed. However, as the random maneuvers continued, their precision began to falter. The once predictable simulations began to glitch. For the first time, the Xanthar seemed uncertain, their systems unable to adjust quickly enough to the erratic nature of humanity's movements. The calm and calculated Xanthar were rattled. Their superior technology, which had always made them so confident, was now a hindrance. It wasn't designed to handle the chaos that humanity had introduced. But it wasn't enough. The Xanthar quickly recalibrated their systems and adjusted their strategies, reverting to the superior tactics that had previously overwhelmed humanity. They weren't outsmarted yet. Captain Alexander realized that they needed to take it a step further. This wasn't just about confusing the enemy. It was about taking their confidence away, piece by piece. The next phase of the plan was even bolder. Humanity would begin to leave small, deliberate mistakes in their tactics. This would create the illusion that humanity was making rash, thoughtless decisions. The Xanthar, with their overconfidence, would assume they had the upper hand, that they were simply biding their time before delivering the final blow. But they were falling right into humanity's trap. Alexander's forces began to lose battles on purpose, leaving the Xanthar thinking they had the game in the bag. As predicted, the Xanthar started to relax. Their simulations showed that humanity had no real hope of winning. They started to make careless decisions, assuming they could finish the game without even trying. But Captain Alexander knew this was exactly what they needed. Humanity's weakness had always been their unpredictable nature, and now, that very weakness was the Xanthar's biggest flaw. The Xanthar had assumed that humanity would continue fighting like they always had, head-on, with brute force. But humanity had learned. They had learned to adapt, to play the game of manipulation, of misdirection, and above all, of patience. And then the moment came. Just as the Xanthar thought they had won, humanity made their final move. They didn't attack head-on. Instead, they launched a series of false retreats. The Xanthar followed, thinking they were close to victory. But what the Xanthar didn't know was that humanity had set a trap in their wake. They had purposefully guided them into a position where they could strike from behind. It was a subtle move, a small shift in their tactics, but it was enough to send the Xanthar's calculations into chaos once again. For a brief moment, the battlefield froze. The Xanthar's systems had malfunctioned. Their calculated, logical responses were no longer able to predict what humanity would do next. Captain Alexander watched with a sense of growing anticipation. The Xanthar were faltering. Their arrogance had been their downfall. They had underestimated humanity's creativity, their ability to think beyond the constraints of cold logic. The Xanthar, stunned by humanity's audacity, scrambled to regain control of the simulation. But it was too late. The confusion they had caused in the enemy's mind had already begun to pay off. The Xanthar were now on the defensive, something that had never happened before. Humanity's forces, though battered and scattered, were now in control of the battlefield, forcing the Xanthar to adapt to their unpredictable play. Captain Alexander smiled slightly. It wasn't over yet, but the tides had turned. The Xanthar had underestimated humanity, assuming their logic and technology were superior. But in the end, it was humanity's ability to think differently, to take risks, and to fight with heart that had turned the simulation in their favor. The Xanthar were learning a painful lesson. Humanity wasn't to be underestimated. And that was the beginning of a war that the Xanthar would never forget. As the simulation continued, both sides now faced a new kind of battle. One that would be fought not only with strategies, but with minds that refused to follow the predictable patterns of their opponents. The final victory was still uncertain, but the Xanthar had learned something vital. Humanity had outsmarted them at their own game. And that was only the beginning of what was to come. The Xanthar, once proud of their superior intellect and unmatched tactical simulations, were now faced with something they hadn't anticipated: unpredictability. For centuries, their species had prided itself on a level of strategy that left no room for error, no space for mistakes. They had developed simulations that could predict every possible outcome, every potential move from their enemies. But humanity's actions were unpredictable, and it was starting to get under their skin. Captain Alexander had made a daring move, and now, the Xanthar were forced to recalibrate. Their confidence, which had once been unshakable, was beginning to show cracks. They believed they were on the verge of a flawless victory, but the human cadet army had done something that defied all logic. They had given the Xanthar a false sense of security. In the moments that followed, the Xanthar fleet adjusted their simulations, thinking they had humanity cornered. They assumed that the humans, after making some rash retreats, were now planning to give up. The Xanthar's cold, calculated minds saw this as a sign of weakness, a final act of desperation. They began to deploy their forces to finish off what they believed would be the end of the conflict. But Alexander's strategy wasn't just about tricking the Xanthar once. It was about exploiting their arrogance. He knew the Xanthar would make assumptions based on their superior understanding of warfare, and he played on that assumption with precision. What the Xanthar didn't realize was that their enemy wasn't just a fleet of ships, but a thinking species capable of learning from mistakes and adapting faster than they could anticipate. Humanity's next step was bold. Using the chaos they'd caused, Captain Alexander gave the order for his cadets to act like they were making another retreat. It was a carefully calculated move designed to lure the Xanthar deeper into their trap. For days, the Xanthar's forces followed humanity's supposed retreat, pushing further into enemy territory with confidence. But the deeper they went, the more vulnerable they became. All the while, humanity's forces had been hiding in plain sight, setting up in strategically significant locations. The Xanthar's mental algorithms, accustomed to a straightforward pattern of human behavior, couldn't detect the looming threat. The humans were setting the stage for an ambush. It was a classic military tactic, but the Xanthar, in their arrogance, didn't consider that humans would have the patience and the cunning to lay a trap so carefully. The humans were taking risks, yes, but these risks were calculated, born of a deep understanding of their enemy's mindset. They used the Xanthar's overconfidence against them. Every move they made was designed to cause confusion and panic in the Xanthar's ranks. The final act of their scheme began when the human fleet, appearing weakened and scattered, suddenly turned on its attackers. At first, the Xanthar thought it was another last-ditch effort, an act of desperation, but it was anything but. The humans had set their positions with deadly precision. In an instant, the Xanthar were forced into a two-front battle. The retreat they had been following so eagerly turned into a crushing counteroffensive. Humanity's cadets, though small in number, were ferocious in their attacks. They used every inch of the battlefield to their advantage, making quick, unexpected strikes at the Xanthar's weakest points. The Xanthar were stunned. This wasn't what they had expected. It wasn't the brutal force they were accustomed to. It wasn't the strategic genius they had predicted. It was something more. The human element of surprise. Every part of their advanced simulations, built on the assumption that humanity would follow a predictable pattern, was now useless. They were in unfamiliar territory, unable to adjust their calculations fast enough to respond. As the human forces made their push, Captain Alexander ordered his cadets to continue the assault, not with raw power, but with precision. They took advantage of the Xanthar's surprise, using their speed and maneuverability to outsmart their opponents at every turn. The Xanthar were being outplayed, outmaneuvered, and outsmarted at their own game. They were no longer the ones in control. By the time the Xanthar realized they had underestimated humanity, it was too late. Their arrogance had led them to believe that humans could never match their intellectual superiority in warfare. But humanity had proven them wrong. Captain Alexander's plan had not only forced the Xanthar into a position where they were reacting to human moves, but it had shattered their confidence. The humans had done what no one thought possible. They had turned the tables on the Xanthar, using their arrogance and overconfidence to break their hold over the battlefield. The Xanthar, for the first time in the war, were the ones on the back foot. But the battle was far from over. While humanity had taken the first crucial step, they knew they couldn't stop there. The Xanthar were not a species to give up easily. They would adapt, recalibrate, and fight back harder. The war wasn't decided in this single battle, but humanity had proven that they were capable of more than just brute strength. They could think, adapt, and fight in ways the Xanthar never thought possible. And now, the real war was about to begin. The Xanthar, after enduring the unexpected twists of humanity's cunning strategy, now faced an internal crisis. Their once unshakable confidence was beginning to crumble. Every attack they launched was countered by human ingenuity, and their fleet was being picked apart piece by piece. Captain Alexander had succeeded in making them question everything they believed about warfare, but the Xanthar were not easily defeated. They regrouped, recalculated, and adapted, just as Alexander knew they would. The game, however, had shifted. Now, the Xanthar had to play humanity's game. They had underestimated the resilience of humans, thinking they were predictable. But now, They were faced with an enemy that didn't follow the normal rules. Humanity had turned the battlefield into something the Xanthar could not account for: chaos. Their superior tactical simulations, once thought infallible, were now being overwhelmed by an enemy who had no fear of bending the rules of conventional warfare. The Xanthar general, Commander Vokta, had spent hours poring over the simulations, searching for a flaw in the human strategy. But every time he believed he had pinpointed a weakness, another unexpected move threw his calculations into disarray. Alexander had played them so well that even the Xanthar's most advanced technologies were failing to predict humanity's next move. The human tactics were unconventional, but effective. The Xanthar found themselves in the unfamiliar position of being reactive, always on the defense. Human cadets, once thought to be no match for the Xanthar, were now a symbol of how far humanity had come. They weren't just fighting, they were outthinking their enemies at every turn. In each skirmish, they learned something new, something the Xanthar had overlooked. They began exploiting the Xanthar's own tactics against them. The Xanthar's strength in numbers became a weakness, as their forces were stretched thin and unable to focus on a single target. Alexander's cadets knew how to move in small, calculated groups, taking down critical targets before fading back into the shadows. Commander Vokta, desperate to regain control, made a bold decision. He decided to break free from the rigid tactics that had failed him and resort to pure aggression. The Xanthar fleet began to converge on humanity's forces with overwhelming power, hoping that sheer might would break through. But this new approach only played into humanity's hands. Captain Alexander had anticipated this shift. He had known the Xanthar would resort to brute force, and he had prepared for it. The human cadets were not only trained in battle strategy, they were trained in exploiting psychological warfare. The Xanthar might have been a powerful species, but they were not immune to fear. Alexander knew that a sudden, unexpected attack on their command center could throw the entire Xanthar fleet into disarray. So he set his plan in motion. The human forces began to retreat in apparent disorder, a move designed to lure the Xanthar into a false sense of victory. The Xanthar, thinking they had broken through, pursued eagerly, unaware that they were walking directly into a trap. As they drew closer to what they believed was the final human stronghold, Captain Alexander issued the order. The human fleet, scattered across the galaxy in small groups, sprang into action. The Xanthar's numerical advantage meant nothing when they were fighting a battle on multiple fronts. Humanity's cadets, moving with precision and speed, launched a series of devastating attacks. The Xanthar's ships were hit from all sides, overwhelmed by the coordinated assaults. The Xanthar, accustomed to crushing their enemies with overwhelming force, suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of the same tactics they had once used to destroy others. Commander Vokta, in a desperate attempt to regain control, issued orders to regroup, but it was too late. The human cadets were everywhere. In a series of coordinated hits, humanity disabled critical Xanthar vessels, turning their once formidable fleet into a tangled mess of burning debris. The Xanthar's own weapons turned against them, as their ships became stuck in a deadly web of traps and miscalculations. The Xanthar were reeling from the loss. They had not anticipated that a species they had considered inferior would outplay them in this manner. Their belief in their superiority had blinded them to the possibility of failure. Commander Vokta watched in horror as the tide of the battle turned in humanity's favor. As the Xanthar fleet began to retreat, it was clear that their vaunted simulations, which had once been their greatest strength, had become their greatest weakness. They had calculated for every possibility, except the one that humanity had thrown at them. And now, humanity was no longer a weak and predictable adversary. They were the ones in control. Captain Alexander, watching from his command center, knew the Xanthar were not yet defeated. But for the first time, they were the ones on the back foot. Humanity had proven that it could fight, and it could outsmart its enemies. The war was far from over, but the Xanthar had learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the ingenuity of a species fighting for its survival. As the smoke of the battle cleared and the Xanthar retreated into the distance, the human cadets regrouped. They were bruised, battered, but not broken. They had won a crucial victory, and they knew it was only the beginning. The galaxy had learned a harsh truth that day. Humanity was not to be underestimated. As the remnants of the Xanthar fleet retreated, the humans took a brief moment to regroup. Captain Alexander stood on the bridge of his ship, watching the stars stretch out before him. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. He felt the weight of their victory, but there was no time for celebration. The Xanthar would be back, and when they did return, they would be even more determined to crush humanity once and for all. But something had changed. The humans had shown them a side of themselves the galaxy had never seen before, and Alexander knew the Xanthar would not soon forget it. The human fleet was battered, many of the ships were heavily damaged, and the cadets were exhausted. But the victory, however small, had filled them with a sense of purpose and pride. They had done the impossible. They had outsmarted the Xanthar at their own game. Now, humanity was no longer the weak, inexperienced species they had once been. They had proven that they could fight on equal terms with the galaxy's most powerful forces. In the days that followed, Captain Alexander received a series of reports from the human fleet. The Xanthar, though battered, were already beginning to regroup. Their losses were significant, but they still had the numbers to launch another assault. The time was coming when humanity would face them again, this time with even higher stakes. As Alexander reviewed the reports, a feeling of dread settled over him. The Xanthar had underestimated humanity before, but now they knew what humanity was capable of. The galaxy was watching, and the humans had made their mark. But in doing so, they had painted a target on their backs. Every faction, every power in the galaxy, would be watching closely, waiting for the next move. Some would seek to destroy humanity, while others would seek to control them. Humanity was no longer a hidden gem in the vastness of space. They were a known force, and the game had changed. The next steps were critical. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning. The Xanthar were already planning their counterattack, and Captain Alexander had no illusions about what would happen when they returned. The humans had no choice but to prepare for the next wave, to evolve further, faster, and become a force the Xanthar couldn't ignore. "Captain," the voice of his communications officer broke through his thoughts. "We've received a transmission from the Galactic Council. They want to speak with you." Alexander didn't hesitate. The Galactic Council had been silent during the early stages of the conflict. They had watched from the sidelines, unsure of where humanity stood in the grand scheme of things. Now, after the stunning victory over the Xanthar, they were reaching out. But why? Was it to offer help, or to offer a warning? "Patch it through," he ordered, sitting back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. The image of a stern, gray-skinned alien appeared on the screen, its sharp eyes fixed on Alexander. The figure was a high-ranking member of the Galactic Council, and Alexander immediately sensed the gravity of the conversation. "Captain Alexander," the alien began in a cold, clipped tone. "The Council is intrigued by your recent actions. We've been observing your progress with great interest." "I'm glad to hear that," Alexander replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "The Xanthar were a threat to all of us. Humanity did what was necessary." The alien's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in its eyes. "Indeed. However, your actions have not gone unnoticed by other powers in the galaxy. There are concerns about how humanity might respond to further threats. The Xanthar were only the beginning. There are factions out there who are not as understanding as we are. Some are already preparing to counter your growing strength." Alexander's mind raced. The Xanthar were one problem, but now it seemed that humanity had made enemies in high places. The Galactic Council, despite their apparent neutrality, were now warning him that their involvement might not be as benevolent as it had seemed. "What do you want from us?" Alexander asked, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. The alien tilted its head slightly. What we want is simple. We want you to understand that you cannot continue this fight alone. The Xanthar were just one enemy, and they will return. But there are other dangers, greater dangers, that you have yet to face. If you want humanity to survive, you will need to accept help from the right sources. I don't need your help, Alexander replied, his voice firm. We've proven that we can stand on our own. The alien's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. Perhaps, but the galaxy is vast, and not all of it will welcome you. The Xanthar may have been defeated, but other powers will not be as easily outsmarted. You will need allies, whether you like it or not. The transmission cut off, leaving a silence that felt heavier than before. Alexander knew the Council's message was more than just a warning. It was a subtle demand. They wanted humanity to bow to their influence, to join their alliances. But he had learned from the Xanthar. Humanity didn't play by the rules the galaxy had set. He wasn't sure if this offer of help was an opportunity or a trap. He turned to his officers, each of them sharing the same sense of unease. The Xanthar might have been the immediate threat, but there was a larger storm brewing in the galaxy, and humanity was right in the middle of it. The question was no longer just about survival, it was about identity. Would humanity continue to carve its own path, or would it bend to the will of the powers that now saw them as a threat? Captain Alexander stood up and gazed out at the stars once again. The battle with the Xanthar was only the beginning. What lay ahead was unknown, but one thing was certain. Humanity would never be the same again. They had earned their place in the galaxy, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Humanity had made a mark on the galaxy, and the ripple effects were still being felt. While the Xanthar regrouped in secret, building their forces for a potential second strike, the larger galactic powers were now closely watching humanity's every move. Captain Alexander's inbox was flooded with requests and demands, from allies, enemies, and everyone in between. The Council's message had lingered in his mind, gnawing at him like an itch that couldn't be scratched. They wanted humanity to play nice, to follow the rules of an ancient game that the galaxy had been following for millennia. But Alexander knew that humanity's way of doing things had already disrupted that game. The question now was, would the galaxy ever accept them as equals, or were they destined to be a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game? Humanity's fleet had been working around the clock, repairing ships, training new cadets, and preparing for whatever the Xanthar might throw at them next. But even as they trained and prepared, their future felt uncertain. Alexander knew that he had to take a stand. Humanity couldn't remain neutral forever. They had proven their strength, and now it was time to decide what they would do with it. One evening, as Alexander stood in the command center of his flagship, gazing out at the stars, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Lieutenant Maris standing there, a solemn expression on her face. "Captain, we've intercepted another transmission," she said. "It's from the Xanthar." Alexander's heart sank. He knew it was only a matter of time before they made their move. He braced himself for whatever was coming next. "Put it through," he ordered. The screen flickered to life, revealing the Xanthar commander, his face streaked with the remnants of battle. The scars on his face told a story of many hard-fought battles. But his eyes, those eyes were different. There was something almost respectful in them. "Captain Alexander," the Xanthar commander began, his voice low and heavy with grudging admiration. "You and your people have shown us something we never expected. You have defeated us once, but we now know that we cannot underestimate humanity again." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" "We have no illusions about your intentions," the Xanthar commander continued. "But we also know that a larger threat looms. Our enemies are gathering in the shadows, and we cannot face them alone. We are willing to offer an alliance." The words hung in the air like a challenge. An alliance. Humanity had just defeated them, but now they were offering to join forces. It didn't make sense. Alexander remained silent, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what the Xanthar could possibly gain from such an offer. "You want to ally with us?" Alexander asked, his voice skeptical. The Xanthar commander nodded. "We've seen the potential of humanity. You have the strength to survive, to adapt, and to defeat even the most formidable of foes. But there are enemies out there, far more dangerous than the Xanthar. The war we've been fighting is just a prelude to something far greater. If we don't work together, we will both be destroyed." Alexander's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. It was a dangerous offer, but one that couldn't be ignored. The Xanthar had been humanity's enemy for so long, and the idea of allying with them went against everything Alexander had ever stood for. But he couldn't ignore the truth in the Xanthar's words. There were enemies out there, and humanity was still a fledgling force in the galaxy. Alone, they might not survive what was coming. "How do I know this is not a trap?" Alexander asked, his voice cold and calculating. The Xanthar commander's expression softened, as much as a Xanthar's expression could. "You don't, but you have no choice. We can either fight separately and be destroyed, or we can unite and face this greater threat together. The choice is yours." The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Alexander staring at the black screen in front of him. He was no longer sure who the true enemy was. The Xanthar were dangerous, but the larger threat was still a mystery, one that loomed on the horizon, just out of reach. As the days passed, Captain Alexander weighed his options. The offer from the Xanthar was not something he could take lightly. An alliance with them would be an uneasy one, but it might be the only way to survive what was coming. The galaxy was a vast, unpredictable place, and humanity had only just begun to scratch the surface of its complexities. It was time for humanity to make a choice. Would they take the Xanthar's offer, forge an alliance with their former enemies, and face the unknown together? Or would they strike out alone, relying on their own strength to protect them from whatever threats lay ahead? On the bridge of his ship, Alexander gazed out at the stars once again. He knew the stakes were high. The future of humanity, and perhaps the galaxy itself, rested on the decision he would soon make. But one thing was certain. Humanity was no longer a quiet, insignificant species. They had proven their strength, and no matter what came next, they would face it with unwavering resolve. No matter the cost, they would carve their own path through the galaxy, and they would do it together.